Hello and welcome. I'm Chris McLaughlin, the Institution of Engineering and Technology, Ireland. I wish to welcome you to our presentation, which celebrates the first transatlantic telegraph transmission of 1866 from Heart's Content in Newfoundland, Canada to Valentia in Ireland. I also wish to extend a welcome to Engineers Ireland Cork region who are joining with us today. I now invite Tara Bishop of Heart's Content Cable Station to make an introduction. Tara.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tara Bishop. I'm the site supervisor here at the Heart's Content Cable Station, Provincial Historic Site. Welcome to our commemoration of the 155th landing of the Transatlantic cable on July 27th, 1866. Today, we're here to commemorate that event with a live link with our partners in Ireland. We will now call upon Doug Card and Sean Walsh to do the Morse transmission.
Thanks for that, Doug. Now over to Sean to make a Morse response. Sean.
Yeah, that went fine. So we've laid our shore. Our shore end has just been laid, and what a good cable with God's blessing and so on, and all the message continued on.
Thank you, Sean. I'll now pass back to Tara in Heart's Content. Tara.
We received your message here, Sean, loud and clear.
That's great.
I'd like to just call upon Doug Mercer, the Vice President of the Ham Operators of Canada.
Thank you very much, Tara. And the relationship between this event and the cable station and amateur radio operators around the world has grown over the years. As Tara said, I represent the Radio Amateurs of Canada, which has approximately 5,000 members across Canada. And I'm very happy to bring greetings to you folks in Valentia this morning. On a personal note, 3 years ago, my wife and I had the pleasure of touring Ireland by a tour bus through with CEI Tours. We landed in Dublin, and for the next 12 days, we saw many beautiful sights and historic events that have taken place in Ireland. And I must say, you have a beautiful country. One of the most memorable mornings, I guess, we spent in the town of Derry, the walled town of Derry, and we're given a tour by what we were told was the only Buddhist monk in Ireland. And he was a very interesting chap. Took us all around the walled city, and I must say it was a beautiful day. So thanks you for the chance of coming here this morning, Tara, Barry, and the folks in Valentia. As I say, you have a wonderful country, wonderful people. So thanks again, and we'll pass it back to you, Tara. And I think Barry wanted me to read the message first that Doug sent. It went like this: "As our shore has just been laid, a shore end has just been laid, and a most perfect cable under God's blessing has completed. Telegraphic communication between Heart's Content and Valentia, connecting Europe and the continent of America." Then the reply from Valentia: "Heart's Content, this is Valentia. Received your message, and yes, what a glorious day this is. May this connection be a permanent one." Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I now call upon Mayor Fred Cumby, Mayor of Heart's Content. He's going to give you a few words as to what the cable station did for the town in the beginning and continues to do today.
Yes, my name is Fred Cumby. I'm the mayor of the town of Heart's Content. I bring greetings on behalf of the residents of the town of Heart's Content. Shirt and no pocket. My talk this morning is on the significance of the impact of the cable landing. But before that, I'll go off script a little bit, because when I think of Cyrus Field and Monty Gisborne and the landing of the cable, I thought of Rudyard Kipling, who wrote a poem called "If." And that poem was from that. It was, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumphs and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. Cyrus Field and Monty Gisborne, their successes and their failures are well documented. But you know, they stayed true to their dream, and their dream became a reality, and that reality was the successful landing of the cable here in Heart's Content. It was a feat that changed life here in Heart's Content. It changed it considerably. You now had a company that came here, and the gap between the cable office workers and the people that lived in this community for 100 or so years prior to that, the level of prosperity changed between them, and the gap, of course, was obvious. When I was growing up here in Heart's Content, the first memory for me was how poor things were. My mom and dad lived in a small house, and in the wintertime they would have to warm rocks to put it at the foot of the bed to keep us warm. In the wintertime, we'd have to go and break the water in a barrel or a bucket to be able to get water to boil a kettle or to cook. But that all changed as years went by. But in the meantime, I'm just trying to emphasize the difference between what was a cable company, because with people living in the cable houses, they had coal furnaces, they had the electricity, they had water and sewer, and there's the gap between those that were living here and those that became employed with the company. But with the company, prosperity came, and a lot of things changed. Heart's Content became a very prosperous town. We grew up to a population of 1,200 in the 1880s. Of course, with the coming of the cable, there was a lot of other jobs that came with it. Now, as I grew up, I remember how a child had died, my next door neighbor, probably in 1949. And she died from whooping cough. This is the type of life that Newfoundland was in a part of. And that changed, of course, with the Confederation and that. But in the meantime, my first experience with the changes that Western Union had brought, that the cable landing had brought, is when I went to school. When I went to school, I went to the boys' bathroom, and here we had urinals that were flushing continuously. That was amazing for a child at 5 years old, didn't have running water in their home. But with the coming of the cable, we had many things that made a difference. The water supply was brought throughout the town, and throughout the town there were places where the residents could get water. They were called tanks. We didn't recognize a lot of the improvements, a lot of the benefits that we had. We just took it for granted. I just walked through the museum a few minutes ago, and I saw a little alarm box. And that alarm box was a fire alarm box. And they were stationed throughout this community with a hammer that you could break the glass. And there was a little shelter there that you had a fire hose. And but even way back then, we had fire protection. Most people probably didn't even take notice of it. But certainly, as I grew up, I found that the schools here were fantastic. The benefits of the town, to me, I grew up here until I was 17, and it was an idyllic life. We had good education system. We had a CLB group that was formed here, the CLB Church Lads Brigades, and that was way back in the early 1900s. And they had everything that you could possibly ask for, even by today's standards. We had boxing gloves, we had parallel bars, we had all kinds of exercise equipment, and of course we had the training and the uniforms that went with it. So it was a discipline that that came, but this all came about not just because of the advances in today's society, but it came about because of the prosperity that came with the landing of the cable. I can go back to other things that I saw, and when I looked at the number of people that had graduated in our schools, I look at the doctors, I look at the lawyers, I looked at the professors, nurses. So our school system was fantastic. This all came about, again, as a result of this first successful landing of the cable. Heart's Content was changed, but the change wasn't always good for some people, because the gap between the people that worked outside the cable station didn't change significantly. With some people, partially. But those that were still working for fishing and logging, the prosperity wasn't there. And so there was a gap between the people. But in the meantime, I always found that the people working with the cable station, and I had lots of opportunities to associate with them as a boy growing up. And I found these people were really down-to-earth people. And I really like to emphasize that because, you know, I played with their grandchildren, I played with their children, my sister played with their children. And sometimes people say that these people were lording it over people, but I never found that in any time during my living here in this and growing up in this community. I found that these people were down to earth, wonderful people to be a part of, and a great contribution to this town. When I came here to Heart's Content, I left here when I was young, but I kind of had a better vision of what was happening when the time that I was growing up here. And my mom operated the telephone exchange here. We had telephones. My mom operated a telephone exchange in 1949, and she operated that until it became automated in 1967 or 68. But she operated that all that period of time, and that telephone exchange was in our home. And of course, we also had electricity. Electricity wasn't a regular thing throughout Heart's Content and communities nearby. And telephones were very few. But these were some of the things that, again, was a part of the cable landing of the cable station. It was an impact on the community. When I look at the power station that came in the 1920s, I'm sure it was developed because of what we have here. My view of the significance and the impact is this, that, you know, in 2016 rather, we had the 150th anniversary celebration of the landing of the cable. At that particular time, we had hopes that the site here would become a UNESCO designated site. And sure enough, December 20, 2017, we were put on the designated heritage list. The town of Heart's Content is now partnering with Valentia to hopefully, when I say partnering, we are twins. We're twinning with Valentia. And we're hoping that Valentia will become a designated heritage site for Ireland, and then we can then look at a World Heritage designation for this community and for Ireland and for Valentia. That is one of the impacts that this cable station continues to have on this community. If we can bring ourselves to a point that we become a World Heritage designation, then in all likelihood you'll see prosperity increasing again. Although when the cable shut down, the cable station shut down here, there was a letdown. But in the meantime, the town of Heart's Content is now coming back, and you can see the impact of what happened when the cable station shut down, but you can also see the benefits of what had happened all during the period of time that we had a cable station here. To me, I grew up here, it was an idyllic life. I couldn't ask for better. You know, I had all kinds of places for entertainment. I had places for education. I had just about anything that a larger city could ask for. And that's where the cable impact made on the town of Heart's Content. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mayor Cumby, for a most enjoyable and informative presentation. I would now like to invite Derek Cassidy to give his talk. Derek.
Right, Valentia Island, an evolutionary change in comms. Basically, Valentia Island itself came to prominence in the 1840s and 50s due to the slate that was produced in the slate yard on the island, and it became well famous. But in 1854-55, Cyrus Field decided to design or come up with a link between Ireland and Canada. Why Canada? Because Canada was the closest part of the Americas to Europe, and why Ireland? Because, of course, Ireland is the closest part to America. So basically in 1854-55, he started to bring together a team which included Tilson Bright, a famous engineer who had wired Ireland already up with the actual telegraph, and along with numerous other people, especially from Britain, they set up a company to actually bring a telegraph cable from Ireland all the way over to Canada. Obviously, there was 3 attempts. There's actually 5 attempts. The first 3 attempts were 1857-58. Unfortunately, the cable actually broke. But there's one thing that actually stands out in history to mark that event is, for the first time in history, 2 ships actually met in the middle of the actual ocean without any GPS coordinates or charts, and they managed to meet each other. And from there, they actually eventually, in 1858, they actually laid the cable from Bull End to Valentia Island. But unfortunately, the cable actually failed after a month. In 1865, due to delay in the American Civil War, they started again. This time they used the biggest ship in the world, which was the SS Great Eastern, designed, built by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The cable itself, a huge ship, was capable of carrying all the cable for the 1865 test or lay itself. And unfortunately, 600 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, the cable broke, but it broke at a depth of 12,000 feet. First officer Robert Halpin from Wicklow, who had actually charted the actual cable itself, marked the actual spot on the actual ocean floor where the cable had fallen. Some people say he laid a buoy on the ocean surface so he could actually identify where the cable was when he came back again. But to this day, no one's been able to prove that, because obviously with the ocean currents and all that, and he would have to have a rope roughly 12,000 feet long hanging from the cable to actually be able to do that at the exact same time the cable broke is far beyond what people could think. But in 1866, they tried again. This time they tried with a totally different cable design. And the 1866 cable set out on the 13th of July, and on the 27th of July, it was landed in Heart's Content. And from there, the very first telegraph transmission was sent across, the very first successful transatlantic cable. You have to go back to 1858 to understand that the very first telegraph transmission had happened. But basically, this cable itself had actually lasted more than a month. It lasted a couple of years. Therefore, it is actually seen as the very first cable to actually make it all the way across and last. Therefore, today, 155 years ago, is seen as the start of long-haul telegraph systems. The 1866 transatlantic telegraph cable was capable of succeeding due to 3 factors. The submarine cable design. The design itself was capable of taking the stress of being able to be laid on the seabed roughly at a depth of maximum depth 14,000 feet and hanging off the actual cable ship. The biggest cable ship of its time was capable of holding the full cable itself. And of course, the remarkable Irishman and First Officer Robert Halpin, who himself had actually come up with the idea of when the 1866 cable was laid. He went back out again in the end of August, and in the 9th of September, he managed to actually land the 1865 cable again. Therefore, in the matter of 2 months, 2 transatlantic cables were landed. An actual feat that actually hasn't been surpassed today, to be able to physically grapple a cable that's 12,000 feet on the seabed, just going from charts and not having anything to actually mark out where the cable is. And after approximately 30 days, they actually managed to grapple the cable and bring it to the actual surface. The telegraph transmission from the original telegraphic cut or telegraphic field in actual Valentia was the original transmission point. It's actually on the opposite end of the island to the actual cable station we have now, but there was an inland cable that actually went all the way over to Knightstown, which then connected it to Capacitive. But the telegraph hut itself was operational for 3 years, but in 1868 they actually built a brand new cable station. So they actually used the inland telegraph cable to actually join up to the telegraph cables there, the 1865 and 66. And they developed the actual new transatlantic telegraph system from Valentia. So Valentia itself, its birth is 2 years after the 1866 cable, but in itself, all the technology, the innovation, the science, and the research into long haul telegraph transmission actually happened here. As we see, that the French soon developed their own telegraph transatlantic cable and learned from the developments made with the 1866 cable. Prior to 1866, people were trying to develop an actual cable design, an actual system, or a telegraph, a way of sending telegraph messages for such a long distance, and they actually physically couldn't overcome the losses in voltage. But by the development and the research that went into the 1866 cable and the success that it actually brought, many other companies, many other people started to look at that, actually how they did it. The innovation itself has moved on because it was actually, as we call it today, open source. And in 1869, Brest to Kansas, or Newfoundland, was laid, and it actually became the third transatlantic cable, because the 1865 and 66 cable were already there. But by opening up the Atlantic itself to another cable route, allowed other companies then to actually come across and see how it was actually done. And soon Ireland actually became the gateway to this sort of long haul transmission to Canada. But the biggest success of the 1866 cable was the British government looking towards how they can actually connect India to the telegraph system, because India was the jewel in the actual crown of the colonies. But unfortunately, the only way they could actually connect India to England was actually overland. And by going overland, you're going over territories not owned or colonized by Britain. Therefore, the cable itself or the transmission wasn't secure enough. But by, again, looking at the innovation and the research and the whole setup of the 1866 cable, they could then now develop their own long-haul transmission. And as you can see, it actually goes from Portcurno. So Portcurno itself is also one of the oldest cable stations in the world, was opened in 1870. And from here, the cable actually goes down to Portugal, then goes along the Med, then goes the Red Sea, and then over to Bombay. The actual link from Cairo down to Aden to Bombay is actually longer than the 1866 cable. So they're actually able to transverse the longer distances, because that's the biggest issue they actually had with getting to India, was getting from Aden to Bombay, overcoming that actual distance. Another thing they actually managed to do was the link from Portcurno all the way from Bombay actually travels across colonies occupied by Britain. So it was a fully secure cable, and it wasn't open to tampering at all. Here we see the actual cable itself. It's taken from the British Indian submarine telegraph cable, as what it's called. But the cable length itself, when you look at it, doesn't look that long, but it's actually longer than the 1866 cable. And the transmission capabilities that they actually had to overcome on this long distance was aided by the technologies they discovered in 1866, and also by the operators, an awful lot of them who came from Valentia, who used their skill and their research into helping to actually get the transmission to work and overcome the barriers that were in the way, and by getting their skill and the experience which they had into actually making this cable work, and bringing it from the previous designs which they worked off, they actually managed to connect India to Britain in 1870. Then, now we look at Valentia, it became the international telegraph gateway and the access gateway to the North oceans of the Atlantic between Europe and Canada. As you can see, there's numerous cables actually go from Valentia. Then obviously Waterville itself opened up, because Valentia itself was becoming the leader in or the center of excellence for all telegraphic submarine cables and cable stations, followed by Hearts Content in Canada, who partnered with Valentia in delivering the super highway of telegraphic data between the two continents, the old and the new. And all transmission, they reckon between 90 and 95% of transmission between Europe and America actually went between those two actual cable stations. An enormous feat in itself, when you think that the fact that Valentia is so far west in Ireland and Hearts Content is so far east, that they actually held such a sway in the transmission of all data. The red line, as some British historians call it, is a telegraphic line that actually circumnavigates the globe. It's a telegraphic system where Britain itself can actually control all telegraph messages and know that all telegraph messages sent on it are secure, because every single cable station along the line is owned or operated by British telegraph operators, and an awful lot of these operators actually were trained by operators from Valentia, or are actually operated by operators from Valentia itself, because Valentia at one stage had up to 200 operators, and an awful lot of them actually got moved on to different roles across the globe, and an awful lot of them became telegraphic officer generals of the likes of India, Canada, and the far off islands and townslands like Cape Town, for instance, and Perth, were all managed by people who actually came from Valentia, who actually trained in Valentia, and who trained under the superintendent in the Valentia, James Graves. As we look at the cable design, and don't forget, as I said, the 1866 cable itself was a brand new design. It helped overcome the deficiencies in the cable design of the 1857-58 cable and the 1865 cable, which itself had deficiencies in tensile strength. But the 1866 overcame that cable. As you see an example there on the left, the 1858 cable. The actual outer armoring is actually very weak. But if you see the 2008 cable, which is an example of a cable used for transoceanic optical fiber cable itself, the design isn't much different. The center armoring itself, as you can see, surrounded by the polyethylene core, is not actually used as an armoring for the cable. It's actually only a strength member for the fiber optics. The armoring itself actually goes around the cable. That cable you see there is a deep sea cable. The cable in the 1858 is also a deep sea cable. Difference is the tensile strength of the 2008 is about 6 times stronger than the 1858 cable. So even an actual cable wrapped in plastic is actually stronger than the 1858 cable, because of the actual cross-sectional area of the actual strength members themselves are actually stronger. But as you see, as you go along to the right, you see the different designs all the way down to the rock armor cable. The rock armor cable itself takes its design directly from the 1866 cable, as in the outer armoring itself is a thick 2.5 to 3 millimeter cross-sectional area of steel wire, which itself has a very strong tensile strength, but it's actually twisted around the cable. Therefore, it amplifies the actual strength of the cable itself, able to reach such deep depths into the Pacific and the North Atlantic Ocean. But the cable designs, which I'm trying to get to, have not changed. they're still the same. Again, they learn from what has been overcome in past history to develop a new way of designing something that works. But if you have something that's already designed to the best you can get it, why change it? Why fix something that's not broken? But there's another big change that the 1866 cable brought, and it wasn't just to telegraphic transmission or to cable design, it was the markets. For instance, cotton dealers and people who dealt with cotton and sold cotton across the globe, there was a 6-week delay between the European and American trade and stock markets, and basically because the only way they could actually trade was obviously sending post on the actual postal ships, the ships that actually tried or applied their trade between the two actual continents. So it taken 3 weeks to get from Ireland, for instance, to Canada by boat, and then 3 weeks back again. The minimum was 6 weeks. The maximum could have been 6 months. But with the introduction of the 1866 cable, that opened up everything. So instead of being a 6-week average delay, that was actually reduced to minutes. So basically, stock markets in London and Dublin could then deal with stock markets in New York. Within minutes, they get stock prices instead of waiting 6 to 8 to 10 weeks. So the international stock market itself evolved from the whole emphasis of the 1866 cable. The development of technology that went behind the 1866 and actually delivering a fast telegraphic way of sending messages between London and New York and Dublin, for instance, enabled the actual markets to actually get prices as quick as possible. It also aided the actual military to actually send information on troop movements. And basically, the submarine cables themselves, even though they were owned and operated by private companies, they were soon seen by the governments across the world as being a military option for communications. So basically, a new development in submarine cable technology evolved from this, and that was the military themselves starting to lay their own submarine cables. But also, governments then started buying submarine cables themselves and actually using them for their own use. Taking them over, for instance, in 1914 to 18, the First World War, all ownership of submarine cables went directly to the government, and all transmission was censored. Therefore, the transmission that was sent across it was so secure that basically that the military themselves actually controlled the cables. But when you look at Valentia and you look at the communication and everything else that came from the island, it's people just think that that's all that happened. But when you actually look at it, in 1848, gutta percha, which was seen by Bewley as a way of insulating submarine cable, he actually in 1848 came up with a new way of extruding gutta percha over copper wire, creating the very first submarine cable. The submarine cable there you see at the very top left is an example of the 1850 Dover to Calais cable, which is the very first submarine cable laid across between two countries. It only lasted a day, and the main reason was there's no armoring on it. But it's a development by an Irishman in a way of actually insulating submarine cables or copper wire to create submarine cables. It was the 1851 introduction of armoring that enabled the actual cable itself to actually traverse oceans themselves. Another great example is that actually obviously came from Ireland is the 1865-66 cable, and the actual invention of long-haul telegraphic transmission and the research that went behind it. But you cannot talk about telegraphic transmission in Ireland without actually looking at wireless, at Marconi and the developments of Marconi from 1901 all the way up to 1921, specifically going from the 1901 oceanic cable, also the tests that he did from Cornwall to Canada, or notwithstanding the fact is that two of the transmission sites were in Rosslare and Clifton as well. And in Clifton in 1907, he actually set up his very first transatlantic wireless network. And in 1921, he actually set up his very first duplex wireless transmission system across the Atlantic, where you can actually send and receive telegraphic wireless transmission. But the biggest feat which he had was in 1919, where he actually managed to get the very first voice call over radio from Ballybunion in Kerry all the way over to Canada. And to celebrate this feat, this morning, the Kerry Radio Amateur Radio Club actually managed to, which they do every year, they also send radio transmission over wireless to Canada, and they communicate with their friends in the actual hearts content, and they communicate over wireless as well. Obviously, it didn't happen in 1866. It's to celebrate the invention of telegraph over wireless, which actually happened, and Ireland has a great part to play in its actual the development. As you see, Marconi, as I said, investigated the use of radio telegraph between Cornwall and Newfoundland via Ross area and Clifton. That was 1901. But in 1901, he also set up the first ocean radio service, which was established and fully operational in 1902. But in 1914, that was actually moved to Valentia. So basically, it was actually taken lock, stock and barrel from Ballycotton in Cork over to Valentia Island, where it's still here today, which actually makes Valentia the oldest still operational radio service in the world. So basically, when you actually see it, Valentia Island, everyone hears it on the radio when they're listening to the weather forecasts, or they hear a search and rescue, they hear Valentia is actually this, that, and it's actually from the cable or the radio station, which is the oldest in the world, obviously not with the same equipment, but the fact is it's been in the same spot since 1914. And then in 1919, as I said, the first transatlantic voice over radio transmission from Ballybunion to Newfoundland. Again, all this experience comes from the development of telegraph, the ideas behind the way the lads in Valentia, the cable station themselves, researched the development and the innovation that went behind it. And again, it all came back to Valentia again. It's still in Valentia. But however, we're not here to celebrate Valentia's historical links to communications, submarine technology. We're here to celebrate Valentia's achievements within the communications past, present, and the future. Right. Technological communication innovation has its infancy with the 1866 cable. But where research development started and initiated in Valentia, this kick-started Victorian internet and the web of telegraph connection across the globe. The explosion in data, as people have seen for the last 2 years because of the lockdown and everyone working from home, has its actual parallel in 1866 to 1870 with the development of long-haul transmission, telegraph transmission, connecting the Americas to Europe, connecting Europe to Asia, Australia to Asia, Australia back to the Americas. All has its birthplace in 1866, connecting Valentia to Hearts content, enabling the two cable stations, roughly 3,000 kilometers apart, to communicate and within minutes been able to receive messages, where months before 1866 actually took weeks, if not months, to get. Like the explosion in communication networks across the globe helps society to innovate and take the next step in its the evolution in the technology that again has its birthplace. 1866 is an innovative year in the birth of international telegraph comms, that actually people didn't realize the actual step it took to the communications that we have today. Another great feat that actually came from Valentia was James Graves and his other superintendents and officers actually looked at ways of using the submarine cables, the 1866 cable, the 1865 cable, and other subsequent cables that were then no longer in use, to actually see, could they be used for other purposes. For instance, James Graves discovered that you could actually, by measuring the electrical current across the cable, if there's a cable break, you can actually identify where the actual cable broke because of using devices and techniques that he along with other people in his areas or his field of study, designed to actually come up with ways of researching this. And again, this is the birth of smart cable systems, which now, for instance, there's a huge big smart cable system in Galway Bay, which basically uses the technology that James Graves and everyone else from Valentia and actually looked at and ways to actually innovate an actual submarine cable, not just to communicate to communicate, but to communicate with the environment, to actually test the environment, to test the temperature, seismic movements and all that. All come from submarine cables, all come from research that was developed on Valentia. And now we have Valentia today. It's hopefully the next couple of years it's going to have another cable, the AOC cable, the Anthony O'Connell cable, again reconnecting Rainier Point to Valentia cable station. It's going to become an actual hub for the innovation, science, a museum which has already started to actually come to fruition. Setting up of a library. Also, as the mayor said, going for World Heritage status. Valentia and Heart's Content are still evolving, still making their presence known in the world of comms, where an awful lot of other submarine cable stations have actually come and gone. Valentia and Heart's Content are still there, and even today, still communicating, still talking, still the link is still there, which is technically today 2 of the oldest submarine cable stations in the world are still communicating. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Derek. I'd now like to invite Sean Walsh to give his lecture. Sean.
Okay then. So for successful communication, first I said telegraphy like Morse, it was only necessary to detect whether a signal was on or off, which allowed successful communication to take place over the first transatlantic cable. However, when speech needed to be exchanged, much more stringent requirements became necessary, particularly bandwidth or the ability of the connection to handle a range of frequencies. Initially, this was only speech, and to minimize and compensate for the effects of the various losses, the typical bandwidth was adjusted to 300 to 3100 Hertz, which gave it the classic telephonic sound that was common over the years. Research had shown that such bandwidth contained the necessary frequencies to provide adequate speech clarity. To minimize the effect of those constraints, telephone circuits. Yeah. Okay, we should be hearing something there. I don't think we did. Okay. In any case, we don't hear that sound much nowadays.
Yes, Sean, we heard that.
Oh, you did. Sorry, that, Sean, yes. Sorry about that, yeah. Okay, so we don't hear that sound much nowadays, as the performance of communication systems has expanded greatly, which nowadays can exchange high quality music and video over many different types of circuits, which have massive bandwidth capacity. Okay, so that would be a very basic diagram of the most basic communication circuit that you could have. Now, that, of course, would not allow communication over a long distance. So major enhancements were introduced as the demand for more channels increased. A fundamental problem on copper wires is the resistance and consequently ohmic losses. This is unavoidable, but especially over long distances, it must be minimized. It was achieved principally by the thickness of the cable, which in old terminology was expressed in pounds per mile. On very long distance trunk lines, 40 pounds per mile was used, but in later times, 20 pound became a very acceptable standard. For shorter distances, 10 or even 5 pound were widely used. However, as voice frequencies were used for communication from 1890 onwards, another significant loss needed to be overcome, namely capacitive reactants. Two copper cables separated by a dielectric, air, or anything else is essentially a capacitor. The reactance decreases as frequency increases, which will result in a progressive short circuit being presented across the line as frequency increases. The solution to this was to introduce an inductor into the circuit at regular intervals. The inductive reactance increases with frequency and consequently is the reverse of the capacitive. This technique to compensate for the reactive losses was referred to as loading. As the requirements of communication channels increased, various techniques and loading standards were employed, which could increase the bandwidth of a circuit to music quality if needed, but more on that later. So we have a more practical diagram there, which includes the line capacitance, the resistance, and the loading coils, as they were called. Okay, so expanded bandwidth became necessary as demand for communication facilities grew. This meant that more than one phone call had to be carried on a cable. This led to the development of multiplexing, or the capability of combining several channels into one circuit between principal communication hubs. There were different methods used to multiplex channels, including frequency division, time division, etc., as the demand and technology progressed. This technology is very widely used today for all forms of data transfer, including mobile phones, computer networking, and broadcasting facilities. The individual techniques are very complex and are too involved to discuss in this session. Suffice it to say that open pair transmission cables were progressively replaced by coaxial and multi-core cabling, which provided access to a much larger range of channels and bandwidth options. I should mention, of course, that those same circuits can also be used to exchange telegraphy and fax and other narrow data requirements, such as alarm remote monitoring, credit card authorization, and so on. A natural progression to telephone technology moved on to provide music quality circuits for radio and television, and of course, nowadays, the data exchange by computer networks. For those purposes, a further refinement became necessary, namely the necessity to have sufficient bandwidth to handle the complex mixture of frequencies and harmonics required for the enjoyment of high fidelity music and data exchange. Instead of the narrow bandwidth suitable for telephone calls, there is a requirement to transfer a range of frequencies from about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, or even more, to 20 kilohertz, or even more to handle high capacity data. A common misunderstanding of this requirement is that humans can only hear up to about 15 kilohertz. So why is more than that required? However, there are harmonics in music well above 15 kilohertz, which contribute greatly to the fidelity of the music we hear. The principal methods employed were different loading standards, the equalization of leased lines, bunch pairs, coaxial cables, and split band techniques. It was possible with proper choice of inductance and distance between correction points to achieve a reasonable music standard on ordinary copper cables. A more widely used technique was the use of equalization, that is, frequency loss compensation on leased lines. This method involved calculating the losses and then building equalization filters to make a mirror image of the response line of the curve. So that would be a typical measured response of an unloaded line. So then we had to build a series of active filters which compensated for those losses and provide as much as we could to a mirror image. And then we got to so there was an input equalization into the cable, went to wherever it went. Then at the other end, there was equalization, correction, and amplification. Now, that was the ideal that we would hope to get. We would have a totally flat response, almost a totally flat response up to at least 16 kilohertz. On the other hand, if we got something like that, we would be fairly happy with our day's work, because the ideal was hard to achieve, in fact, okay? But generally, if the response could be kept within plus or minus 3B, the music quality will be satisfactory. Care also had to be taken not to overemphasize the higher frequencies, because that would lead to audible white noise or annoying hiss. Another limitation was that it was generally considered that successful equalization was only achievable to 75% of the line poundage, or therefore, if the circuit was on a 20-pound line, generally it would be possible to equalize properly up to about 15 kilohertz. An alternative technique was the use of bunch pairs when the cost of permanent leased lines was not justified. This interesting technique involved temporarily hiring two loaded lines and, with the cooperation of the telephone company, shorting both lines at each end and effectively removing the inductors. This basically amounted to providing one unloaded circuit. Then the equalization procedure already described was employed to achieve a good quality music circuit. Over the years, there were various methods used to increase the bandwidth for broadcasting purposes. One common method had been the use of split band equipment, which divided the audio into two groups. Basically, the bass frequencies were put on one band and the higher frequencies on the other. Those circuits were able to provide good speech performance with a bandwidth of about 6 kilohertz, but were rather limited for music quality. Moving on, however, technology did not stand still. In the 80s came digital type ISDN lines. Those circuits became popular for broadcasting and in the early days for higher speed internet, all of about 512 kilobits per second. Wow. However, as digital technology developed quickly, the use of ISDN became less popular, but still exists, even though upstaged and outdated by what's coming next. For many years, long-distance communication circuits were carried by microwave point-to-point links and later also by satellite. Those services were used particularly for wide bandwidth requirements, such as high-volume multiplex circuits between major hubs and television broadcasting services. Those provided the facility of ease of installation, which did not involve the construction of physical cable over long distances. And for some time, those network types were standard technology for international television transmissions. Technology did not stand still, and the new major development is fiber optic cable, which has a massive bandwidth capacity. It is fast becoming the standard connection type, not alone between hubs and international subsea cables, but also the provision of internet and data systems to individual buildings. International TV, data, voice traffic, systems like new apps for mobile and computers, among them Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, TikTok, and even Zoom, which have now become the major methods of communication, especially for the younger generations. Those systems would have been impossible until relatively recently, and even if they were, the cost of provision would be prohibitive. Even phone calls are now transferred as data, because standard phone traffic is handled as data streaming, rather than the methods that have been discussed here. So, 155 years later, the major transatlantic connections are largely once again carrying only data, just like in 1866. International call costs, which were very expensive, have become virtually free due to the expansion of data capacity worldwide. One time, we technical people could not imagine the quality of audio and video that can be exchanged worldwide for mere cents compared to several euros or dollars to make even a moderate distance connection up to recent times. When I departed the broadcasting service, we were handling good quality audio material by digital phone lines, data stored on memory sticks, and radio and television played out from computers and laptops. We were already beginning to exchange programming by internet streaming and gradually moving away from the accepted norms. If I returned today, I am sure I would see many more advancements, in the use of data transfer, which probably have become the accepted communication method for the people working from home, a rather unexpected consequence of this cruel virus that has been visited on us. I would very likely have to explain the historic nostalgia that I may feel. All this must make us congratulate the massive achievement of the transatlantic cable connection with the limitations of the technical expertise at the time. Now, the copper core has been replaced by the new fiber optic, and instead of the 8 or so words per minute that could be handled then, today there are terabits of data moving across the Atlantic, carrying everything from phone calls, internet, social media apps, and television transmissions. So from a very basic single channel connection on a copper cable, the technology has moved to handle thousands of channels on a fiber optic cable. The future is open for us to ponder about what the people in the next century will be saying and perhaps commemorating on our present day limited achievements. Many people in the upper age bracket will remember the wonder in 1963 of seeing live coverage of the funeral of President Kennedy in America, live on TV via the Telstar satellite. The fact that the monochrome picture quality was poor and the satellite went out of visible orbit after about 25 minutes did not in any way suppress our excitement. Of course, now TV in full color and pristine quality is standard viewing, and we expect input on demand from anywhere in the world. After so long and such a breathtaking achievement on this day over 150 years ago, the wheel has turned full circle, and we are now back to on-off information transfer, this time in the form of data. The change is that nowadays many thousands of channels are multiplexed into the modern fiber optic subsea cable. For some of the young among us who may be around in about 80 years, what will their contemporaries be saying about our standards of achievement at this time? I personally could never even have begun to imagine the changes to communication that would be introduced by computers and their associated digital technology systems, including the wonderful internet. As little as 20 years ago, this Zoom conference would not have been possible, or in any case would have been prohibitively expensive. Let's acknowledge our achievements and embrace the future with hope. Thank you for your participation. And now we'll hand back to the cable station in Hearts Content.
Thank you very much, Sean. Yesterday, I pre-recorded a tour of our museum here for you to show you the facility that we work in every day and to show you the exhibits that we so proudly share with our visitors throughout the tourist season here. So it'll last a few minutes, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Hearts Content Cable Station, the landing site of the first successful transatlantic cable in July of 1866. In this room, you'll see a map on the floor which shows you the cable routes throughout the world up until 1901. All these red lines are physical cables that were established in the world up until that point. Here in Hearts Content, we deal primarily with the top 6 red lines in the Atlantic there, and they date between 1866 and 1894. The majority of them traveled from Valentia to Hearts Content, and that's what we used to send transatlantic messages. Our visionaries, Cyrus Field and Frederick Gisborne, are the 2 forefathers of the transatlantic cable. Gisborne had done other submerged cables in other areas, so he knew that the premise would work. and he wanted to take it on a grander scheme. So he sets out to meet Cyrus Field, who at the age of 33 is retired from the paper trade, with his own personal fortune made. At that age, Field is interested in investing his money into the project, and they set out to lay the transatlantic cable. They had many failures prior to landing here in 1866, but eventually, after all those failures and all that money, they did arrive here on July 27th, 1866. A reason for most of the failures would be the size of the ship that they were using initially, and that's when the cable company purchased the Great Eastern. It was the largest ship in the world at that time, measuring 693 feet in length, and it was initially designed as a luxury liner to travel long distances without having to stop to refuel. But people in the 1850s didn't travel all that much, so it failed as a luxury liner, in turn making it more accessible to the cable company, and that's when they purchased it for just £25,000. And they placed 3 large holding tanks to coil the entire length of cable necessary to come from Valentia to Heart's Content in one continuous piece. It took them just 2 weeks to lay the first transatlantic cable in July of 1866. Next, we move into the mirror galvanometer room, where you'll see the first apparatus used to send and receive messages here in Heart's Content. This apparatus is known as a mirror galvanometer. It was used in 1866 to send and receive messages here in Heart's Content. You'll see that the cable would come into the building. The signals would then get into the lightning guard, the attenuator, and then into the galvanometer itself. The galvanometer works on relatively simple science. It works on positive and negative current, mirrors, magnets, and light. So you'll see that the light from the lamp shines upon this little piece of mirror attached to the galvanometer and reflects back upon the screen. So what happens is this large coil here is a magnet. There's a suspended cylindrical magnet right here in this cutout section with a little piece of mirror attached. So as the messages come through as a positive or a negative current, it causes these two magnets to work against each other, in turn reflecting a little dash of light from left to right. When it moves to the right, it was a dot, and when it moved to the left, it was a dash. So what would happen is this would take place in a completely darkened room. There would be 3 people at a station just like this, and one's responsibility was to look at the screen and say whether he had seen a dot or a dash. The second person was a recorder, so they would actually write down what the first person had told them. And then the third person would use 2 keys, one for dots, one for dashes, to send it on. So being polarity, they had to have 2 keys. And this was strictly visual. The Morse code that most people are attuned to today would be the Morse code that you hear. So it's a long and a short electrical connection. So it's a dit and a dot, as opposed to positive and negative for dot and dash. Next, we'll move out into our community room and we'll see how they lived and how they worked. So this room basically shows you a representation of what their leisure activities would have looked like while they were employed here in Heart's Content. The billiards table was brought here when the newer section of the building was built on in 1918. Due to the automatic nature of the equipment that we'll see shortly, this equipment, or this room, was turned into a recreational facility for the employees, and the billiards table was a part of that. And these storyboards will give you their working conditions and their leisure life activities. While being employed here in Heart's Content, they would have enjoyed a very lavish lifestyle, a very eccentric recreational life as well. Their leisure activities were quite unique compared to the people who would have lived here in Heart's Content previous to the landing of the transatlantic cable. This section of the building that we're leaving now was built in 1876, which is 10 years after the cable arrived. So for the first 10 years, they used a temporary wooden structure until the red brick station was completed. Then in 1918, with the advent of the multiplex equipment, which we'll see shortly, this building was not capable of holding all that equipment, so they had to build on a more wide open space, which we'll see on our way now. So here we have our entrance panel. The cables are out in our beach, just across the street from where I stand now. They come under the road and up through the basement to the entrance panel, which you see right here. The original 6 strands of cable are represented here. From there, they are stripped back of their layers and then into their conductor. And then they travel up the wall and across the cable trays above our heads and disperse out into the equipment appropriate to send the messages. Here we have our shipwatch table and our cable test set. The shipwatch table and cable test set are not part of the operation per se. The shipwatch table was used to communicate with a ship that was sent to sea to do the repair, and the cable test set was used by the electrical engineers here in Heart's Content to determine where on the transatlantic cable the damages actually occurred. So what they would do is send out a signal, determine how long it was gone, and time equaled distance. So then they knew an approximate distance as to how far out the ship would have to sail. Once they arrived at that distance, they would start grappling or grappling. So they would use a grapple hook, and it's a large anchor-like hook, and they'd sweep the bottom of the ocean until they actually hooked into the cable. They bring the cable up to the ship's side, splice in a new piece, and let it sink back into the ocean again. Sounds relatively simple, but with the ocean as deep as it is in the deepest point, it would often take them a few days to find where they were looking. So the first part of the multiplex operation, now multiplex means multiple messages, multiple directions at the same time. So we're now looking at how the station looked in 1965 when it closed. So the first stop of a transatlantic signal, or any signal for that matter, that came here to Heart's Content would be the amplifiers. And that's these 7 lockers. And what they would do is remove any distortions found in that signal and strengthen it back up to full strength, so that as the messages traveled across the island of Newfoundland into the mainland of Canada, down into the United States, they would remain strong enough to be received at their final destination. Traveling roughly 1,800 nautical miles under the Atlantic, the signals would be relatively weak by the time they arrived here, as there was no actual amplification on the cables in the ocean up until around the 1950s, when they put in a couple of submerged repeaters that didn't actually do what they had intended. So from the amplifiers, we come to the oscillograph. And the oscillograph is a visualization of what the signals would have actually looked like once they left the amplifiers. So you'll see on the long strips of horizontal paper there, you'll see sharp peaks, deep valleys, and also plateaus. The peaks and the valleys would have represented distortions still found within the signals, and the plateaus would have represented good, strong, solid signals. So they were looking for something that was very square-like, as opposed to something with a sharp pulsation. After we leave the oscillograph, we come over here to the multiplex distributors. And the multiplex distributors actually do what their name says they do. They distribute the messages. So you have a 6-channel distributor and a 4-channel distributor, and each channel had the capacity of holding 300 letters or characters per minute per channel, as opposed to the mirror galvanometer, which we just saw downstairs, receiving 8 to 10 words a minute. So all of your channels on your distributors are represented over here on your patch panels. So if by some chance one of those channels on the distributor broke down, they could come over here, isolate that channel, plug into a free channel, and let the message continue on. A key point to the multiplex system is that the operators employed here would have been here primarily for maintenance practices and troubleshooting, as opposed to actually manually sending and receiving messages. So that's the reason for the recreation part downstairs. During the night shift, the cable company needed something to keep them awake because they were here just to make sure everything was running smoothly and had a lot of free time on their hands. Next, we have the hotline to New York, which is a direct, dedicated line between the Western Union station here in Heart's Content and the main Western Union station in New York City. And it was used only in times of breakdown on the cables or distorted messages making their way through the system without being noticed. The operator responsible for this piece of equipment would stand here, and the red light at the top of this station would flash and alert him of the fact that there was a message coming from headquarters. Then the operators would plug in these teleprinters, and they would print out feet upon feet of these little ticker tapes of the messages going through the system at the one time. Once they sat and analyzed these messages, they would see whether or not Heart's Content's equipment was responsible for the malfunction. If we had people on site who would do all the repairs necessary to get us up and running again. If not, we would simply send a message back to New York, tell them all clear here in Heart's Content, please check another station. After their maintenance is complete, they come over here to the multiplex test table, where they would type out 3 words for every letter of the alphabet in succession from A to Z, like bean, Boston, brown, down, dark door, or landlocked lobster. It's a standardized test to ensure that all the keys on the teletype machines were representing correctly. It only tested the equipment in Heart's Content station, and it was used after there was maintenance done to ensure that everything was up and running again. So we'll just go over here to the message route and tie it all together for you in a larger picture. So prior to the transatlantic cable, London and Valentia had been connected with a small submerged cable, the same as what would have happened on the North American side, with Newfoundland being connected to the mainland of Canada and eventually down into the United States. So this basically shows you that the one link that we didn't have at this point was a transatlantic cable between Valentia and Heart's Content. So in 1866, when Cyrus Field and the Great Eastern pulled up just in the harbor across from where I stand today, it revolutionized the way that the world communicated. Initially, the transatlantic cable was used for governments to communicate on a daily basis, to balance out commodities on the stock markets, and also just kind of pass the news from both sides of the Atlantic as well. It wasn't just a simple way to say hello or happy birthday. It was quite expensive to send a message as well, at 20 pounds for a 20-word message. So basically, the world got a lot smaller 155 years ago today, and it continues to get smaller. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a little look at our museum here. I will now pass it back to Chris.
Thanks, Tara. I'd like to thank you for an excellent tour and discussion on the cable station. Would you like to now sum up with comments for Heart's Content, and then I will follow with comments for Valentia.
Sure. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of the participants and guest speakers for participating today. It's great to commemorate the 155th anniversary of the Transatlantic cable landing here in Heart's Content. And we hope to continue this as an annual event. Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to put a face to the name when you see emails every day from all of you folks in Ireland. So it's great to see who we actually communicate with on a daily basis. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Tara, for your comments. I would like to thank Merck Combi, all of the speakers and presenters for their excellent presentations today. We look forward to hosting more events in following years and to meeting up with all of you again in the future. Thanks again to all of you for participating, and goodbye for now. Goodbye.